Hello. Thank you, Claire. That was a lovely introduction. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank Hor Al-Qasimi and the Sharjah Biennial 14 team, which have all been really fantastic to us. So thank you. So where to start? Look for us all around you. That is Claire's theme for her contribution, which this reading that I'm going to do is really a reflection upon that. And I wanted to start with, because we're here, what is Blackness? I think that that is an open proposition that needs to be addressed perhaps more directly. Blackness is a mode, a means, a methodology, and also a way of being in the world. However, to be clear, while those given to Blackness, that is, Black people, have a particular relationship to it, Blackness is not exclusively our domain. This is oftentimes the difficult fact of Blackness. And still, although it has a marvelous capacity to be expansive, Blackness never entirely escapes Black life, which shapes its contours and animates its force. Blackness is a vector of transmission and transformation across Black worlds, of a multitude of capacious and unstable events, affects, and aftermaths, constituent to modernity and therefore modernisms. Because it arises from the social construction of race, that is, that Black people did not walk out of Africa saying, I'm Black. That was manufactured under the terms of capitalism. Blackness as affect and aesthetic operates through and takes shape from those very conditions. One need only observe how Black matter circulates, accumulates, oscillates, extracts, and is extracted, repeats and is uniquely unstable, better even dynamic, dispersed, expansive, and precarious. In this way, though German social and economic theorist Karl Marx does not provide us with an aesthetic theory, we can think of Blackness in art in the sense in which he describes capitalist economies. Whether we produce widgets or art, we produce the conditions of our lives. The concept of Blackness and its conditions of emergence through enslavement and the persistent vestiges of the mark of Blackness that extends from it is the unrepresentable specter haunting our proceedings today. While transatlantic discourse has dominated enslavement and diasporic studies concerning Africa, there is a multiplicity of periods and events and formations that led to the dispersal of Black people, including throughout the Indian Ocean and between East Africa and the Middle East. What is shared between these diverse events and encounters is the global force of capitalism. In Arabia and the Gulf, the rise in demand for slave labor accompanied the expansion of production of commodities, such as dates and pearls for global markets. Ironically, Imperial Britain made abolition of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean a centerpiece of its 19th century colonial policy. The enslavement of people was thought to be an inextricable, long-standing dimension of Arab life, and therefore unrelated to the increasing market opportunities of global capitalism, which accelerated the demand of human ownership. Such developments counter and are exceptional to theories in which neo-economics, with its promise of free markets and free labor, would bring slavery and coerced labor to an end. Indeed, the institution of slavery and its trade grew with global connectivity across epochs. It is only with the later collapse of the date and pearl industry around the 1920s that the slave economy of Arabia would begin to come to an end before later assuming a different guise. It is important to note, as is the case throughout the Americas, there are a wide range of differences in the systems of enslavement in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, yet none of them should be considered normative. Between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, the degrees of oppression, the sense of Black identity, the political urgencies differ dramatically. Further, the majority of enslaved people in this region are not of African descent. Nevertheless, like a black hole absorbs matter, African descendant Arabs are part of the Black diasporic fold. An important scholarship is taking place to expand our collective understanding of its unique dimensions and characteristics. The complexity of the region's culture, social life, and economics, and the poetics and pitfalls of diasporic belonging are important facets of Tracy Rose and Misak Gaba's contributions to this biennial. Rose lends her fiercely feminist slant to a conceptual matrix that considers enslavement in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean, Marcus Garvey's Pan-African model of economic empowerment, and the figure of the Moor in a dispersive quality that is distinctly her own and uniquely diasporic. Gaba makes hybrid forms amalgamating architecture and trade systems as processes of globalization in ornamental wig sculptures, while Wu Sang's project illuminates the ways in which the negative aspects of global capitalism have come to define the general condition for people all over the world and flight from its ravages. I would like now to turn to some observations from our part of the world, the Americas, which are equally relevant to Claire's curatorial framework for the biennial. For some time, there has been extensive writing, including the work of American Black Studies scholars Fred Moten and Saidiya Hartman, concerning fugitivity as a condition of the enslaved, or what we could describe as an insistence upon unsanctioned movement. I want to glance this notion of flight, of escape, of taking leave in another direction, away from fugitivity and towards Martinican poet and philosopher Edward Glissant's notion of errancy, which is in plain sight. Another way to put it, it is showing up to withhold. Performances of Blackness have generally been limited to particular styles of music, theater, dance, and popular culture, which has fostered a historically narrow perception that Blackness in art had a distinct status in modernism, often relegated to the realm of so-called primitivism, and thought to have a natural disposition toward spontaneous expression instead of thoughtful purpose or action. Peter Friedel's project for the Sharjah Biennial of the first and last Black ringmaster at the Barnum and Bailey Circus concerns this history. In the Americas, indeed, wherever the specter of capitalist exploitation in relation to the estrangement, or more precisely, the overwhelming fungibility of the Black being has occurred, the body as material for a Black artist has often been overwhelmed with historical meaning and scopic regimes, as well as laden with signifiers and markers that are deeply related to historical narratives. In such a context, artists engaging the conceptual dimensions of racial Blackness, which is to say the very system and structures through which the concept of race developed, circulates, and is sustained, have evolved formal techniques and aesthetic operations that challenge legibility, rely upon opacity, and proceed by errancy. Errantry does not concern melancholic longing or seemingly unending agitation from a heartbreak of fundamental loss. The matter of origins is an impossible question to answer, is irrelevant, not by choice, but by fact. Such conditions and context require that we instead find and ride the edge of our capacities individually and collectively. Errant acts, if we think of them as improvised choreographies, are less about abandonment or disavowal, but an imaginative pursuit of what is possible in the aftermath. Those of us who have an embodied knowledge of Blackness, who have to contend with the longue durée of enslavement, colonialism, and capitalist extraction, in which the past is at times indistinguishable from our present or a desired future, have manufactured ways to contend with the structural position imposed upon us. This is to say, we have had to set new paths within incredible constraints. As Glissant suggests, quote, identity is no longer completely within the root, but also in relation, end quote. Diaspora is indeed the call of relation. Relation is always a multiplicity, polyvocal, polyrhythmic of the multitude. In comparison to the colonialist arrow-like nomadism, as Glissant describes it, conquest, manifest destiny, universalism, we errant ones subverse centrality in deference to anarchy, unsettled truth, skepticism, yet with a sense of overwhelming expansiveness, which is dispersed in every direction, a necessarily illegible, opaque, and thick cartography, aligning through relation as we must and as we desire. The root is not important, movement is, as Glissant has it. Ironically, such precarious alignments, not centered on national alliances, for example, have the capacity to reaffirm identity precisely because of movements, the negotiations attendant to it, and the performances that arise from it. It is because exile is very real that errancy requires what Glissant describes as an imaginary vision that we must nevertheless constantly reach for. Such vision and literal play on the notion of roots is present in Ulrich Lopez's artwork, which we just saw, which draws upon classical ballet, ritual, and mythology to create a cross-boundary performance sculpture built around Cuban Santeria, a syncretic spiritual system with roots in Nigeria and Benin. The Kingdom of Benin, the art and ceremony of the Edo, histories of exploration and conquest, are also the animating forces of Leo Asimota's representation here in Sharjah. Over time, artists have been able to summon a body, yet through aesthetic tactics attempt to alleviate its historical and social weightedness by acknowledging particular histories and social conditions, while simultaneously expressing a desire to maneuver, circumnavigate, and reimagine them. In the wake of myriad debates about and movements dedicated to the subject of Black representation, artists have turned to a vector of opacity in which their works operate and treasure above all else what can be described as this productive withholding. This inclination can be understood as a catalyst toward dematerializing social structures at the level of the individual, and thereby coming to know oneself in the larger social schema. What remains after such a process is a stark reminder of the vitality of the unrepresentable, the indiscernible, the elusive, and all that is deficient at the level of the visible. In recent years, Black artists have made Black works with their Black bodies in places of literal or metaphorical darkness. Typical modes of signifying are thus obliterated. Primarily interdisciplinary, total works of art with visual art, dance, language, the projected image, and sound elements in equal measure have emerged from experimental scenes in which opacity, obfuscation, and darkness are tactics, strategies, and modes of Blackness as artistic resistance. As a counterpoint, informed by the critical and historical contributions of Frantz Fanon, Saidiya Hartman, Ronald Judy, Orlando Patterson, American scholar Frank Wilderson posits Blackness as an ontology of slavery, measured solely in relation to the state, its apparatuses of power, and ultimately the structure of that power relation. A cursory review of Wilderson's writings exemplify his thought on the matter. The Black, these are all quotes, a subject who is always already positioned as a slave. The slave lacks human capacity. The slave is a sentient being and not a subject. A Black is the very antithesis of a human subject. No slave is in the world. The slave is not a laborer, but an anti-human, a position against which humanity establishes, maintains, and renews its coherence, its corporeal integrity, a being outside of relationality, and so on. The awesomeness of his language resides in its invariably different sameness, supported by a myriad examples that might buttress its veracity even more daily by the invariably different sameness of the conditions of contemporary Black social death. And you can see this in the States, you can see this in France, you can see this all over Europe, you can see this across the Mediterranean, you can see this in Brazil. To use the parlance of Afro-pessimism, where gratuitous violence, the state, and precarity intertwine, which is to say at every instance the either is present, for Afro-pessimists, the distinction of being a slave has one neither in nor of the world. Indeed, Wilderson insists that no analysis concerning a slave can be approached in relation to civil society, quote, unless and until the interlocutor first explains how the state is of the world. And meaning you have to have some ownership in this. Wilderson's take builds upon American feminist and literary critic Hortense Spiller's meaningful distinction between the flesh and body in the typing of Black beings in the context of social enterprises, whereas, quote, before the body there is flesh, that 0 degree of social conceptualization that does not escape concealment under the brush of discourse or the reflexes of iconography. Even though the European hegemony stole bodies, some of them female, out of the West African communities in concert with African middlemen, we regard this human and social irreparability as high crimes against the flesh. If we think of flesh as a primary narrative, then we mean its seared, divided, ripped apartness, riveted to the whole ship's hull, fallen, escaped, overboard. Which, and here I'm thinking of Mohau Morosekeng's performance yesterday, and it certainly brings to mind the migrant crisis out of the Middle East and Africa. To insist upon the flesh is to call attention to the sensual cover of Blackness. The flesh that Spiller calls into account also marks the foretaste of a certain state-sanctioned violence against Black beings, perversely evident today as it was at the beginning of a relentless, continuous theft of the body of life. So I insist on the flesh in order to understand the ways in which such repetitive acts work. The insistence on the flesh, for unlike the body, has no cover, but is ever laid bare. For Martinique and France Fanon, a fantastically complicated figure, the complexity of racial subjectivity was, quote, a deceptively obvious fact of Blackness, end quote. As art historian Kobina Mercer puts it, in his writing on the 1952 book, Black Skins, White Mass, Fanon, quote, constantly oscillates between multiple points of view, end quote. And we should add draws upon the multiple registers, autobiographical, clinical, sociological, poetical, philosophical, and political. Mohamed Bourouissa's poignant, beautiful biennial project summons Fanon's time as a psychologist and revolutionary in Algeria, which we saw yesterday. Alienation, or what I have been describing in Glissantian terms as the lack of roots, requires an acknowledgement of economic and social conditions that is inherently anachronistic. Epidermalization, this is Fanon's brilliant word, marks the inscription of these realities on the skin. However, paradoxically, the skin is a signifier that is cultural, social, and historical. It is through figures like W.B. Du Bois and Fanon that Blackness can be thought of as a mode, a means, and a way of being in the world, but not exclusively a lived experience. Fixating upon the visuality of Blackness and attempts to contain it operates through the scopic regimes that express their power by ever locking race in our field of vision. This is what Fanon described as being, quote, sealed into that crushing objecthood, overdetermined from without, otherness of the self, end quote. The result is the persistent questioning of who am I? For Fanon, such a historical racial schema, quote, weaves him out of 1,000 details, anecdotes, stories, battered down by tom-toms, cannibalism, intellectual deficiency, fetishism, racial deficits, slave ships, and above all, show good eaten, end quote. His response to such constraints is, quote, I propose nothing short of a liberation of the man of color from himself. He offers as much an approach to bring to the surface into representation that which has sustained the regimes of representation unacknowledged, to subvert the structures of othering in language and representation, image and sound, discourse, and thus to turn the mechanisms of fixed racial signification against themselves. A spectacular matrix of unintelligibility and ambivalence that misplaces materiality and orality, since, as Lacan has it, identity operates at the level of the imaginary. As Wilderson suggests, quote, we need a new language of abstraction to explain this horror, a quest to forge a language of abstraction with explanatory powers emphatic enough to embrace the Black, an accumulated and fungible object in a human world of exploited and alienated subjects, end quote. What might an adequate, emphatic aesthetic look like? In the aftermath of the Harlem Renaissance, negritude in the Caribbean and West Africa, particularly Senegal, Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, in post-apartheid South Africa, we already have more than a century of diasporic artistic production emphatic enough about Blackness. Therefore, what is the qualitative failure that incites Wilderson's call to action? Perhaps in seeking a new language of abstraction, we should look precisely to its aesthetics and question why it has been rendered suspect in responding to the insistence upon Black artists to represent authentically. As Wilderson notes, Black authenticity is an oxymoron, for it requires the kind of ontological integrity which the slave cannot claim. What would the afterlife of Blackness look like in total obscurity? What if it manifests itself in the most oblique, opaque, and dense ways? Would we find a space of imagination in the sinkhole, in the break, in the hold, as we stray? One of the ways such an aesthetic of withdrawal would make itself known is precisely as a structural position of non-communicability, silences, breaks, voids, pressed and presented to you so that you never recognize their prior manipulation. Such tactics do not concern or employ negation. Rather, they are decoys, rerouting and rearranging at the level of surface as veneers of language and incongruent sounds, thick facture, shaky angles, blocked apertures, conceptual density, and dark light, in order to explore the very impossibility and necessity of its existence. Jace Clayton's mashup of Afro-Cuban bass thumb pianos and social polyrhythms no doubt exemplifies such a sensibility. While Torquasi Dyson and her collaborators Zachary Fabry and Andreas Hernandez engage dark matter in the most oblique, which is to say productive ways, revealing its capacity to sieve a range of wieldy, unwieldy references from the environment to geography to architecture to migration and beyond. And the black burrs and dark verve going on in much of Hannah Black's art does that. One doesn't need recognition of one's imagination. Imagination disavows being for the captor. What I am arguing for here is an imagination as a strategy of formless disassembly through assembly of the incommensurable and incomprehensible. Non-visibility would be our extreme abstraction to which there are myriad approaches and styles as a condition of possibility for the imagination, where through its ruminations are a pattern of irrationality and a refusal to living a life of fatality gains momentum. These artists' contributions to the Sharjah Biennial 14 propose alternative types of representation through various modes of dissonance. In their own distinct ways, each summons a blackness in search of its own event horizon, an absolute void, a total darkness that is not nothing, which is to say, not a single thing. But perhaps maybe, like a multitude constituted in and through chance, chaos, noise, a stutter, a fragment, a fold, they evince modes of errancy, illegibility, withholding, and opacity. When sieved are expressions of capacities to delight our imagination. Thank you.